I was born in a small village outside Lyon. My father was a baker, like his father before him. The smell of fresh bread in the morning, the warmth of the ovens in winter, that was my life. Simple, good. I thought I'd spend my days doing the same, carrying on the family trade, marrying a local girl, raising children who'd smell of flour and yeast just like I did. Then 1914 came, and everything changed. I was 22 when I joined up. Not out of any great patriotic fever, mind you. It was simply what you did. The Germans had invaded France. They were at our doorstep. Every able-bodied man had a duty. My father understood. My mother wept, but she understood too. France needed her sons. Basic training was in the south, away from the fighting. They taught us to march, to shoot, to follow orders. Made us feel like soldiers, like we were part of something grand and important. We sang the Marseillaise with pride in our hearts. We believed we'd drive the Germans back within months. Everyone said so. By early 1916, I knew better. I'd been at the front for over a year by then. Seen enough to know that this war wasn't going to end quickly, wasn't going to end cleanly. The trenches stretched from the Channel to Switzerland, and neither side could break through. We'd gained meters at the cost of thousands of lives, lost those same meters the next week. On and on, an endless grinding stalemate. February 1916, they told us we were being sent to Verdun. The name meant little to me then. It was a fortress city on the Meuse River, strategically important, heavily fortified. Ancient forts ringed the area. Douaumont, Vaux, others whose names I'd learned to hate. We were told it was a quiet sector, that we'd get some rest after the fighting further north. The train journey there was cold. February in northeastern France, everything frozen and gray. We huddled together for warmth, playing cards, smoking, trying not to think too much about what was coming. Some of the older soldiers, the ones who'd been at the Marne, at Ypres, they were quiet. They knew that quiet sector was just something officers said to keep morale up. We could hear Verdun before we could see it. A low rumble in the distance, like thunder that never stopped. Artillery, always artillery. As we got closer, the rumble became a roar. The sky to the northeast was lit with flashes, even in daylight. The ground trembled beneath our feet. The city itself was being evacuated. Civilians streaming past us, going the other way, their faces blank with shock and fear. Old women, children, families with whatever possessions they could carry. They looked at us, young men marching toward the guns, and I saw pity in their eyes. Pity for us. We reached the reserve trenches on February 20th. The bombardment was already heavy, had been for days, according to the men rotating out. But they said it was manageable, said the forts would hold, said the Germans were just probing our defenses. That night, I tried to sleep in a dugout that smelled of earth and unwashed men. The ground shook continuously from the artillery. In the distance, I could see the flashes lighting up the sky, could hear the shriek of shells passing overhead. I thought about my father's bakery, about the smell of bread baking, about how far away that life seemed now. I didn't know, couldn't have known, that the real hell was about to begin, that what we'd heard so far was just the prelude, that in the morning the Germans would unleash something the world had never seen before. I didn't know that Verdun would become a name spoken with horror for generations, a symbol of everything terrible about this war, a place where men would die by the hundreds of thousands for ground that didn't matter, couldn't matter, except that both sides had decided it must. All I knew that night was that I was afraid and cold, and very far from home. The next morning, February 21st, 1916, the world ended. It started at 07:15 hours. I remember the exact time because I was looking at my watch when the first shells hit. But started isn't the right word. The world didn't start. It exploded. The sound was beyond anything human ears were meant to hear. Not individual explosions, but one continuous roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Germans had massed over 1,000 guns along a front just 8 kilometers wide. They fired all of them at once. The dugout I was in seemed to lift off the ground. Dirt rained down from the ceiling. The support beams groaned and cracked. Men were shouting, but I couldn't hear them over the noise. Couldn't hear my own voice when I tried to shout back. We stumbled out into the trench, and the world was fire and smoke. Shells were landing everywhere, ahead of us, behind us, all around us. The ground heaved like a living thing. Where there had been a trench wall, now there was just a crater. Where there had been a dugout, now there was nothing. Sergeant Moreau grabbed my arm, shouting something I couldn't hear. He pointed toward the forward positions. We were supposed to reinforce them, supposed to hold the line. But how do you reinforce positions that no longer exist? We ran through the trenches. What remained of them? Bodies everywhere, men killed by the concussion alone. No visible wounds, but dead all the same. The trenches were collapsing, filling in with earth thrown up by the explosions. In some places, we had to climb over rubble that had been protective walls moments before. A shell landed close. The blast threw me against the trench wall. My ears rang so loudly I thought I'd gone deaf. Couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched whine. Moreau's mouth was moving, but no sound came out. Blood ran from his nose. Mine, too, I realized. The bombardment went on, and on, and on, hours of it. Unending, merciless, mechanical destruction. The Germans were using everything. High explosive shells that could destroy a building, shrapnel shells that burst in the air and rained death, gas shells that filled the low areas with choking poison. They were trying to erase us from the earth. By midday, the forward trenches were gone, simply gone. The landscape had been transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Nothing lived there anymore. Nothing could live there. We fell back to the second line. Not in any organized way, just whoever could still walk, stumbling through smoke so thick you couldn't see 5 meters ahead. Men were crying, praying, or just staring with blank eyes. Some had gone mad from the noise, were trying to dig with their bare hands, trying to burrow into the earth to escape. I found myself in a shell hole with 4 other men. None of us from the same unit, just whoever had fallen in during the retreat. One man was wounded, hit by shrapnel in the leg. He was trying not to scream, trying and failing. The bombardment continued into the afternoon. We learned to recognize the sounds, the distant thump of the gun, the growing shriek as the shell approached, the moment to press yourself flat and pray it wasn't your time. We learned, but knowing didn't help much. The shells fell random as rain. Death was pure chance. Around 1600 hours, it intensified. Didn't think that was possible, but it did. They were preparing for the assault, we knew. The infantry would come soon, would advance across the destroyed ground while we were still reeling, still deaf and shocked and broken. But we had to hold. Had to. This was Verdun. This was France. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. The words were repeated up and down what remained of the line. They shall not pass. At 16:45, the bombardment lifted. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been. My ears still rang. Everything felt muffled, distant, like being underwater. Then we saw them. Gray shapes moving through the smoke. German infantry advancing in waves. They looked like ghosts in the murk. Fire! Fire! Someone was shouting. We raised our rifles with shaking hands and fired into the gray mass. Men fell. More kept coming. They reached our line in some places, hand-to-hand fighting in the ruins of the trenches, bayonets and rifle butts and desperate struggling in the mud. I shot a German soldier at point-blank range, watched him fall, felt nothing. No triumph, no horror. Nothing. Just turned and looked for the next target. We held that first day, barely. By nightfall, the Germans had taken some of our forward positions, but the line held. We'd paid for it, though. God, we'd paid. The wounded were everywhere. More wounded than we had stretcher bearers, more than we could help. They cried out in the darkness, French voices, German voices, all the same in their agony. I sat in what remained of a trench, covered in mud and blood, some mine, mostly others, and tried to understand what had happened. 9 hours of bombardment, 9 hours of hell. And this was just the first day. Someone passed around a bottle of wine. We drank in silence. What was there to say? The Germans would try again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. This wasn't going to be a battle. This was going to be something else entirely. Something none of us had words for yet. But we would. We'd call it Verdun, and that name would be enough. Would carry all the weight of what was to come, all the suffering and death and madness that would unfold over the next 10 months. February 21st, 1916 was just the beginning. The first day of a hell that would last until December. A hell that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives. A hell that some of us, the unlucky ones, would survive. I was one of the unlucky ones. It started at 07:15 hours. I remember the exact time because I was looking at my watch when the first shells hit. But started isn't the right word. The world didn't start. It exploded. The sound was beyond anything human ears were meant to hear. Not individual explosions, but one continuous roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Germans had massed over 1,000 guns along a front just 8 kilometers wide. They fired all of them at once. The dugout I was in seemed to lift off the ground. Dirt rained down from the ceiling. The support beams groaned and cracked. Men were shouting, but I couldn't hear them over the noise. Couldn't hear my own voice when I tried to shout back. We stumbled out into the trench, and the world was fire and smoke. Shells were landing everywhere, ahead of us, behind us, all around us. The ground heaved like a living thing. Where there had been a trench wall, now there was just a crater. Where there had been a dugout, now there was nothing. Sergeant Moreau grabbed my arm, shouting something I couldn't hear. He pointed toward the forward positions. We were supposed to reinforce them, supposed to hold the line. But how do you reinforce positions that no longer exist? We ran through the trenches. What remained of them? Bodies everywhere. Men killed by the concussion alone. No visible wounds, but dead all the same. The trenches were collapsing, filling in with earth thrown up by the explosions. In some places, we had to climb over rubble that had been protective walls moments before. A shell landed close. The blast threw me against the trench wall. My ears rang so loudly I thought I'd gone deaf. Couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched whine. Moreau's mouth was moving, but no sound came out. Blood ran from his nose. Mine, too, I realized. The bombardment went on, and on, and on, hours of it. Unending, merciless, mechanical destruction. The Germans were using everything. High explosive shells that could destroy a building, shrapnel shells that burst in the air and rained death, gas shells that filled the low areas with choking poison. They were trying to erase us from the earth. By midday, the forward trenches were gone, simply gone. The landscape had been transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Nothing lived there anymore. Nothing could live there. We fell back to the second line. Not in any organized way, just whoever could still walk, stumbling through smoke so thick you couldn't see 5 meters ahead. Men were crying, praying, or just staring with blank eyes. Some had gone mad from the noise, were trying to dig with their bare hands, trying to burrow into the earth to escape. I found myself in a shell hole with 4 other men. None of us from the same unit, just whoever had fallen in during the retreat. One man was wounded, hit by shrapnel in the leg. He was trying not to scream, trying and failing. The bombardment continued into the afternoon. We learned to recognize the sounds, the distant thump of the gun, the growing shriek as the shell approached, the moment to press yourself flat and pray it wasn't your time. We learned, but knowing didn't help much. The shells fell random as rain. Death was pure chance. Around 1600 hours, it intensified. Didn't think that was possible, but it did. They were preparing for the assault, we knew. The infantry would come soon, would advance across the destroyed ground while we were still reeling, still deaf and shocked and broken. But we had to hold. Had to. This was Verdun. This was France. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. The words were repeated up and down what remained of the line. They shall not pass. At 16:45, the bombardment lifted. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been. My ears still rang. Everything felt muffled, distant, like being underwater. Then we saw them. Gray shapes moving through the smoke. German infantry advancing in waves. They looked like ghosts in the murk. Fire! Fire! Someone was shouting. We raised our rifles with shaking hands and fired into the gray mass. Men fell. More kept coming. They reached our line in some places, hand-to-hand fighting in the ruins of the trenches, bayonets and rifle butts and desperate struggling in the mud. I shot a German soldier at point-blank range, watched him fall, felt nothing. No triumph, no horror. Nothing. Just turned and looked for the next target. We held that first day. Barely. By nightfall, the Germans had taken some of our forward positions, but the line held. We'd paid for it, though. God, we'd paid. The wounded were everywhere. More wounded than we had stretcher bearers. More than we could help. They cried out in the darkness. French voices, German voices, all the same in their agony. I sat in what remained of a trench, covered in mud and blood, some mine, mostly others, and tried to understand what had happened. 9 hours of bombardment, 9 hours of hell. And this was just the first day. Someone passed around a bottle of wine. We drank in silence. What was there to say? The Germans would try again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. This wasn't going to be a battle. This was going to be something else entirely. Something none of us had words for yet. But we would. We'd call it Verdun, and that name would be enough. Would carry all the weight of what was to come, all the suffering and death and madness that would unfold over the next 10 months. February 21st, 1916 was just the beginning. The first day of a hell that would last until December. A hell that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives. A hell that some of us, the unlucky ones, would survive. I was one of the unlucky ones. The days that followed blurred together into a nightmare without beginning or end. Time lost all meaning at Verdun. There was no day or night, just varying shades of gray punctuated by fire and smoke. The trenches, what we still called trenches, though they were barely recognizable as such, became our entire world. A world of mud and death and constant terror. The mud at Verdun wasn't like mud elsewhere. It was mixed with so much blood and remains that it had a texture, a smell that haunted you. Thick and clinging, it would suck at your boots, trying to pull you down. Men who fell wounded in it sometimes drowned before anyone could reach them. We lived in that mud, slept in it, ate in it, fought in it. There was no avoiding it. It got into everything. Your clothes, your food, your rifle. You'd clean your weapon 10 times a day and still find mud in the mechanism. Your uniform would stiffen with dried mud until it felt like wearing armor. At night, you'd try to scrape some of it off, but there was always more. The rats were everywhere. Huge things, fat from feeding on the dead. They were bold, these rats, unafraid of men. They'd run across you while you tried to sleep, would steal food right from your hands. We tried to kill them at first, but there were always more. Eventually, we just learned to live with them, like we learned to live with everything else. Sleep was impossible, yet somehow we slept. You'd collapse from exhaustion and fall into a fitful unconsciousness that wasn't really rest. Always half aware of the shells, always ready to wake and throw yourself flat when one came close. I'd dream of the bakery, of home, then wake to find myself in hell again. Sometimes the waking was worse than the nightmares. The smell was indescribable. Death everywhere, bodies that couldn't be recovered because any movement drew fire. They'd lie in no man's land for days, weeks, slowly becoming part of the landscape. The sweet, rotten smell of decay mixed with cordite, with gas, with the smell of men who hadn't bathed in weeks. You tried not to breathe through your nose, but you had to breathe. Eventually, you stopped noticing. Your nose gave up, your brain gave up. It just became the smell of Verdun. Food came up irregularly. Supply lines were under constant bombardment, and getting anything to the front lines was a feat of desperate courage. When food did arrive, it was usually cold, often spoiled. We ate it anyway. You ate whatever came because you didn't know when the next meal would arrive. Biscuits so hard they'd break your teeth. Tinned meat that tasted of the metal it came in. Coffee that was more mud than coffee. We consumed it all without complaint because complaining required energy we didn't have. Water was worse. The water supply was contaminated. Shell craters filled with rainwater and worse. We'd boil it when we could, but often there was no time, no fuel, no way to make fire without drawing artillery. So we drank it cloudy and foul and hoped we wouldn't get sick. Many did. Dysentery killed almost as many men as shells. The rotation system was supposed to give us relief. A week in the front line, then back to reserve, then to rest. That was the theory. In practice, at Verdun, there was no rest. Even in the reserve trenches, miles from the front, the shells still fell. Men still died. You were never safe, never truly away from it. When you were pulled back for rest, you'd march through the devastated landscape, past the ruins of villages that no longer had names, past artillery batteries firing ceaselessly. You'd reach some shattered building or muddy field, and that was rest. A chance to sleep for more than an hour at a time. A chance to eat hot food if you were lucky. A chance to write letters home that you knew would never convey the truth of where you were. Then, too soon, always too soon, you'd march back up, back to the front, back to the trenches. They called it going up the line, but it felt like descending into hell. With each step closer, the noise grew louder, the destruction more complete. Your stomach would tighten, your hands would start to shake, and you'd wonder if this would be the rotation you didn't come back from. The fighting itself was constant but random. Sometimes days would pass with nothing but artillery. Other times the Germans would attack in force and you'd fight hand to hand in the ruins. We learned to fight in ways they hadn't taught us in training. Fighting in collapsed trenches, in shell craters, in the dark with just bayonets and grenades. Vicious, desperate fighting where the only rule was survival. I killed men at Verdun. Don't know how many. Lost count after the first week. Some at a distance with rifle fire, others close enough to see their faces. Young men like me, scared like me, dying in the mud because old men in Paris and Berlin had decided this patch of ground mattered. I try not to think about them, about the German boys I killed. But sometimes in the night I see their faces. Wonder if they had families, had sweethearts, had dreams of opening a bakery or teaching school or becoming a father. We lost men constantly. Not in great dramatic battles necessarily, but in ones and twos, steadily, relentlessly. A shell would land and Pierre would be gone. A sniper would fire and Jacques would fall. Gas would drift in and another 2 men would die choking. The replacements would arrive, young, fresh-faced, terrified, and within days they'd be dead or wounded or broken. The only constants were Sergeant Moreau and me. We kept surviving, kept going, didn't know if it was luck or curse. Fort Douaumont fell in late February, the largest, strongest fort in the Verdun complex, taken by the Germans. The news crushed morale. If Douaumont could fall, what hope did we have? But the orders remained the same. Hold, they shall not pass. So we held, meter by meter, crater by crater, body by body. We held because there was nothing else to do, nowhere to retreat to, no permission to give up. France had decided Verdun would not fall, and so men like me were fed into the meat grinder to make that decision reality. The artillery never stopped. That's what people don't understand about Verdun. Other battles had lulls, had moments of quiet. Not Verdun. The guns fired constantly, day and night, week after week. The sound became part of you. You'd stop hearing individual shells and just hear the roar, the endless mechanical roar of industrialized death. Your ears bled, your head pounded. You'd scream just to hear something different, but you couldn't even hear your own screams over the guns. Men broke, just snapped. We called it shell shock, but at Verdun it was something more. Men would start laughing and not be able to stop, or crying, or they'd just stare at nothing, not responding to orders, not responding to anything. Some would try to desert, would be shot by their own officers. Others would deliberately expose themselves to fire, choosing death over another day in the trenches. I understood. God help me, I understood why they did it. But I didn't break, neither did Moreau. We became machines ourselves, as mechanical as the guns that hunted us. Wake if you'd slept. Eat if there was food. Watch, always watch. Fire when targets appeared. Duck when shells came close. Help the wounded if you could. Drag the dead to the rear if there was time. Exist. Survive. Repeat. Weeks passed. Then months. March became April, became May. The battle raged on. We lost ground, gained it back, lost it again. Each meter cost hundreds of lives. And for what? For mud and ruins and corpses. But it wasn't about the ground anymore, if it ever had been. It was about not losing, about proving we could endure more than the Germans could endure, about breaking their will before they broke ours. It was insane. We all knew it was insane. But we stayed. We fought. We died. Because this was Verdun, and Verdun had become a symbol, had to be held, had to be, no matter the cost. By April, Verdun had become a machine for destroying men. We fed soldiers into one end and corpses came out the other. The Germans fed their men in two. The machine consumed us all equally, without preference, without mercy. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. The phrase echoed up and down the line constantly. Officers said it. Common soldiers said it. It appeared in newspapers, in speeches, in letters home. It became more than words. It became the reason we were there, the reason we stayed, the reason we died. General Pétain had taken command. He understood that Verdun was bleeding France white, but he also understood that we couldn't abandon it. So he organized the rotation system better, tried to ensure units weren't left at the front until they were completely destroyed. Every French soldier would pass through Verdun, he decided. Everyone would share the burden. They called it the Sacred Way, the road that brought supplies and men up to the battle. Sacred. As if there was anything sacred about what we were doing to each other. But the truth was, we believed it, had to believe it. They shall not pass gave meaning to the suffering, made the deaths matter. If we were holding the line, if we were stopping the German advance, then maybe all of this wasn't for nothing. Maybe Pierre and Jacques and all the others hadn't died for mud and ruins. Maybe they'd died for France. I don't know if I believed it anymore by then. But I said the words. We all said the words. The Germans kept attacking. They'd take a position. We'd counterattack and take it back. They'd bombard us for days, then attack again. We'd hold barely. Then they'd bombard us some more. Endless cycle, endless grinding. Villages that had stood for centuries were erased from the map. Hills were lowered by meters from the bombardment. The landscape was being literally reshaped by the volume of explosives being poured into it. Fort Vaux fell in June. Another fortress gone. The garrison had held out for days without water, drinking their own urine, fighting in the dark corridors with bayonets and grenades. When they finally surrendered, even the Germans respected their courage. Didn't matter. The fort was lost. We fell back again, held again. The heat that summer was unbearable. Corpses rotted faster. The smell grew worse. Water became even more precious. Men died of thirst in trenches, surrounded by their comrades who had nothing to give them. The sun beat down on the devastated landscape, baking the mud, cooking everything in the trenches. There was no shade, no relief, just heat and thirst and the endless guns. I watched men change at Verdun, watched them become something other than human, not in a dramatic way. There were no sudden transformations, just a gradual hollowing out. The light in their eyes would fade. Their faces would become masks. They'd stop talking about home, stop writing letters, stop thinking about after. There was only now, only survival, only the next shell, the next attack, the next meal if you were lucky enough to get one. Sergeant Moreau changed too. He'd been a good man, a father figure to many of us. But as the months passed, he became hard, cold. He'd order men forward knowing they'd die. Had to. Someone had to go, and he was the sergeant. He stopped learning the names of replacements. What was the point? They'd be dead in days anyway. Better not to know them, better not to care. I understood. I'd stopped learning names, too. The gas attacks were particularly horrible. The Germans would shell us with gas, chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas. You'd hear the shells land with a softer sound than high explosive. Then you'd see the yellow-green or brownish cloud rolling toward you, hugging the ground, filling every depression, every shell hole, every trench. Gas, gas. The cry would go up and we'd scramble for our masks. Rubber and glass and chemicals pressed tight against your face. You'd breathe through the filter and pray it worked, pray the seal was tight, pray the gas hadn't gotten in before you could mask up. The gas lingered, would sit in the trenches for hours. You'd have to wear the mask until your face ached, until you thought you'd suffocate from the trapped air and fear. Men who were too slow or whose masks didn't seal properly would choke, would cough up pieces of their lungs, would die slowly, drowning in their own fluids. The gas wounded were the worst to watch. They'd linger for days, gasping, burning from the inside. Nothing to be done for them, just wait for them to die. I learned to hate at Verdun. Real hate. Not the abstract enemy of propaganda, but visceral hatred for the men who were doing this to us. The German soldiers in their trenches suffering as we were suffering. The officers who ordered the attacks. The generals who fed us into the machine. The politicians who'd started this war and kept it going. I hated them all with a fury that scared me when I let myself feel it. Mostly I didn't let myself feel anything. By summer, I'd been at Verdun for nearly 5 months. Most men didn't last 5 weeks. I'd survived through luck and the rotation system and some instinct I didn't understand. But I wasn't the same man who'd arrived in February. That man was dead. Something else wore his uniform now. Something mechanical and empty and capable of terrible things. We counterattacked in the summer. Tried to reclaim lost ground. I was part of the assault on Fort Douaumont in October. We took it back for a while at least. The fighting inside the fort was nightmarish. Dark corridors, smoke, men killing each other in the pitch black. We won, technically. Raised the French flag over the ruins. They said it was a victory. Didn't feel like victory. Felt like more death, more suffering for a pile of rubble. November came. The cold returned. Rain turned the trenches into rivers of mud. Men drowned in shell holes filled with water, froze to death in the open. The fighting continued. Always the fighting. By December, both sides were exhausted. The Germans had pushed as far as they could. We'd held barely, but held. The attacks became less frequent. The intensity dropped, relatively speaking. People started saying the battle was winding down. I'd spent 10 months at Verdun, 10 months in hell. Somehow, impossibly, I was still alive, still functioning, still human, or whatever passed for human after Verdun. The final numbers came later. Hundreds of thousands dead on both sides. Some said 700,000 casualties total. Others said more. Didn't matter. The numbers were too large to comprehend. Each number was a man, someone's son, someone's future, erased in the mud. We'd held. They had not passed. That's what the history books would say. That's what would matter to the politicians and generals. But those of us who were there, who survived Verdun, we knew the truth. We hadn't won. Nobody won at Verdun. We'd just survived, had endured more than the Germans endured, had bled longer, suffered more, sacrificed more. And for what? For ground that could have been abandoned at any time. For a symbolic victory that cost us a generation. For the ability to say they shall not pass and mean it, even as we were destroyed in the meaning. Verdun broke something in France, broke something in all of us who fought there. We held the line, yes, but the price we paid for holding it, that price haunts me still. My breaking point came in November, not dramatically, not with screaming or collapse or any of the obvious signs. It came quietly, in a moment that should have been ordinary. We were in the trenches near Fort Vaux. A quiet day, relatively speaking. Only a few shells falling, only sporadic rifle fire. Almost peaceful by Verdun standards. A replacement had arrived the night before. A boy who looked 16 but claimed to be 19. He had that look they all had, the new ones. Fear mixed with determination. Still believed in glory. Still thought this meant something. He asked me how long I'd been at Verdun. When I told him 10 months, his eyes went wide. 10 months? Mon Dieu, you must be very brave. I looked at him, really looked at him. Saw myself from February, fresh and foolish and doomed, and something inside me just stopped, like a watch that had been wound too tight for too long, and finally the spring broke. Brave? I heard myself laugh. It sounded wrong, hollow. There's no brave here, just lucky and dead. You'll be dead by Friday. He stared at me, shocked. Sergeant Moreau pulled me aside. Easy, soldier. Don't do that to the new ones. But I couldn't stop. Why not? It's true, he'll be dead. We'll all be dead. We're just waiting our turn in the meat grinder. Moreau looked at me for a long moment, saw something in my face that concerned him. You need to go back, get some rest, real rest. There is no rest. There's just more Verdun. He put me in for rotation that night, got me sent to the rear, far from the front. I think he saved my life doing that. A few more days in the trenches, and I would have been one of the ones who broke completely, who ate a bullet rather than face another day. The boy was dead by Friday, just like I'd said. Shrapnel from a shell. Never even fired his rifle. The rear area was strange. There were buildings still standing, trees that had leaves, people who weren't covered in mud. The guns were distant enough that you heard them as rumble rather than roar. It should have been relief, should have been salvation. Instead, it felt wrong, like I didn't belong in a place where people weren't dying, like I'd betrayed something by leaving the line while others stayed. Survivor's guilt, they'd call it later. But it felt more like I'd abandoned my post, even though I'd been ordered away. I couldn't sleep. The quiet was too loud. My ears, used to constant bombardment, heard threats in every sound. A door closing was a shell. Someone dropping something was an attack. I'd wake up gasping, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, ready to fight enemies that didn't exist. The other men in the rest area gave me space. Could tell I was wrong somehow. Broken. They were support troops, hadn't been to Verdun, didn't understand. How could they? How do you explain Verdun to someone who hasn't been there? The words don't exist. The human mind can't process what we'd endured and survived. A doctor examined me, asked questions, looked in my eyes with a light. Shell shock, he concluded. Mild case. Rest will help. Rest. As if rest could fix what Verdun had done. As if a few weeks away from the front could make me whole again. I nodded, agreed, said nothing. What was the point? They kept me in the rear for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of trying to remember how to be human, how to eat at a table, how to sleep in a bed, how to talk to people about normal things, weather, food, home, anything but the trenches. I wrote to my mother finally. First letter in months. Told her I was well, that I was safe, that I'd be home when the war ended. All lies. I wasn't well, wasn't safe. And some part of me knew I'd never really come home, even if my body made the journey. In early December, they sent me back. Not to Verdun. The battle was winding down by then, but to another sector. Quiet sector, they said. I'd heard that before. Didn't believe it anymore. Didn't believe anything anymore. But I went, put on my uniform, picked up my rifle, marched back toward the sound of the guns. Because that's what you did. You went back. The machine needed feeding, and I was still alive, so back I went. I never returned to Verdun itself. The battle officially ended in December while I was in the new sector. They said we'd won, said we'd held the line, proven French determination, stopped the German advance. Victory, they called it. The men who'd been there, we didn't call it victory. We didn't call it anything, just looked at each other with those empty eyes and nodded. We knew what it had cost, knew what we'd become in the holding. I learned later about the scale of it. Over 300,000 French dead. Similar numbers for the Germans. Hundreds of thousands more wounded. All for a salient that didn't matter strategically. All because both sides had decided Verdun was a symbol worth bleeding for. The phrase meat grinder appeared in newspapers. Journalists trying to explain what Verdun had been. But they didn't know, couldn't know. A meat grinder is mechanical, efficient. Verdun was neither. It was chaos and suffering and death drawn out over 10 months. It was systematic destruction of human beings, yes, but there was nothing clean or efficient about it. We'd held because France couldn't afford not to hold, because Pétain had organized the rotations so that no unit was destroyed completely, so that most French soldiers passed through Verdun and shared the burden. 2/3 of the French army served at Verdun at some point during those 10 months. 2/3. We all carried the scar. We all knew. And the Germans? They'd attacked because Verdun was supposed to be a battle of attrition they could win. Supposed to bleed France white. Instead, it bled them too. Everyone bled at Verdun. Everyone lost. Some called it a French victory because we held the ground. Some called it a German defeat because they failed to take the city. I called it what it was. Mutual destruction. A glimpse into how terrible modern war could be. How nations could consume their own sons in pursuit of symbolic victories. Years later, I read that the German chief of staff had called Verdun the mill on the Meuse that ground to powder the hearts as well as the bodies of the troops. He was right. That's exactly what it was. A mill. a machine, grinding us to powder. I survived Verdun. My body survived at least. Walked away from it in December with all my limbs, no visible wounds, physically intact. The doctors cleared me, sent me back to duty. But something died at Verdun. Something in me that couldn't be recovered. The man I'd been, the baker's son from Lyon, who'd enlisted with some sense of duty and honor, he died in those trenches. Maybe in February during the first bombardment. Maybe later, in one of the countless moments of horror. Doesn't matter when. He died there. What survived? What walked away and continued to fight and eventually went home? That was something else. A ghost in human form, going through the motions of life without really living, existing but not feeling, speaking but not saying anything true. Verdun made ghosts of us all. The only difference was that some of our bodies stopped moving and got buried while others kept walking around, carrying the ghost inside. I was one of the ones who kept walking. The war ended in 1918. I was there when the armistice was announced. November 11th, 1100 hours. The guns fell silent. After 4 years of continuous thunder, silence, men cheered, wept, embraced each other. We'd survived. It was over. I felt nothing. Should have felt relief, joy, something. But there was just emptiness. The war was over, yes, but Verdun wasn't over, would never be over. Not for those of us who'd been there. Coming home was stranger than going to war had been. The train journey back to Lyon, watching the countryside pass by. France looked the same. The villages, the fields, the rivers, all still there, unchanged. Only the men had changed. Only we were different. My mother cried when she saw me, held me like I was still her little boy. But I wasn't anyone's little boy anymore. I stood there in her embrace, feeling her tears on my neck, and felt nothing. Wanted to feel something, wanted to be her son again, but that person was gone. My father understood better. He'd fought in the War of 1870, knew something of what I'd seen. He didn't ask questions, just nodded, gripped my shoulder, and let me be. I was grateful for that, for not having to pretend. The bakery was still there, still smelled of bread and yeast. That smell I'd dreamed about in the trenches had held on to as a memory of home, of normalcy. Now it was just a smell. Couldn't connect it to anything, couldn't feel what I'd felt before. I tried to work in the bakery. Lasted 2 weeks. The heat of the ovens felt like bombardment. The sound of dough being kneaded sounded like boots in mud. A bag of flour fell once, and I threw myself to the ground, arms over my head, waiting for the explosion. My father found me there, shaking, covered in flour dust like ash from shells. He didn't make me come back after that. I found work at a factory instead. Metal work, loud and mindless. Better that way. The noise drowned out the noise in my head. The repetitive tasks kept me from thinking. I could lose myself in the work, become the machine I'd been at Verdun. Just existing, just functioning, just surviving another day. The nightmares never stopped. Every night I was back there, back in the trenches. Sometimes I was burying the dead. Sometimes I was being buried. Sometimes I was just walking through that devastated landscape, past the bodies, through the smoke, while the shells fell endlessly. I'd wake up screaming, thrashing. Once I woke up with my hands around my own throat, strangling myself because in the dream I'd been strangling a German soldier. My mother heard me from downstairs, started sleeping with her door closed after that. The sounds got to me. Any loud noise, a car backfiring, a door slamming, thunder, fireworks, and I was back there. My body would react before my mind could process. I'd hit the ground, curl up, hands over my head, or I'd freeze completely, unable to move, trapped in the memory. People stared, pointed, whispered. Shell shock, they'd say. Said it like it was something shameful. Like I was weak. Like I hadn't spent 10 months in hell so they could live in peace and judge me for what it had done to me. I stopped going out much, stayed in my room mostly, safer that way, quieter, less chance of being triggered back to Verdun. My mother worried, tried to get me to see doctors. I went to a few. They had theories, treatments. Nothing worked. How could it? You can't cure experience, can't undo what's been seen and done. I met others like me. Veterans who'd been at Verdun who carried the same haunted look. We'd recognize each other without words. Would nod in passing. Sometimes gather at a cafe, sit in silence together. Didn't need to talk. Just being around others who understood, who'd been there, that helped. More than any doctor could. We'd drink. More than we should. The alcohol helped blur the edges, made the memories less sharp. Made sleep possible sometimes. The hangovers were worth it for a few hours of peace. One of the men I drank with, George, he'd been at Verdun the same time as me. Different unit, but same hell. We became friends, or what passed for friends among ghosts. He understood without explanations, knew why I couldn't eat meat sometimes. The smell reminded me of things I didn't want to remember, knew why I couldn't stand crowds, knew why some days I couldn't speak, just sat staring at nothing. Georges killed himself in 1923, hanged himself in his apartment. They found him 3 days later. I wasn't surprised. Part of me envied him. He'd found a way out, a way to make it stop. I thought about it too, joining him, joining all the others who died at Verdun. Seemed fitting somehow. Seemed like I was supposed to have died there anyway, and living was just a mistake that needed correcting. But I didn't. Don't know why. Cowardice, maybe. Or maybe some stubborn refusal to let Verdun claim one more victim. Maybe just habit. I'd survived this long. Might as well keep surviving. I never married. How could I? What woman would want to share a life with a ghost? What kind of husband would I be, waking up screaming every night, flinching at loud noises, unable to show affection or feel joy or be present in any real way? Better to be alone. Safer for everyone. My parents died in the 1930s, lost the bakery in the Depression. France was struggling, like all of Europe. The peace we'd bled for hadn't brought prosperity or happiness. Just economic collapse and political chaos and the slow, terrible march toward another war. I could see it coming. Everyone could. Germany was rearming. The politicians were making the same speeches, singing the same songs about honor and duty. Young men were enlisting again, eyes bright with the same ignorant hope we'd had. I wanted to grab them, shake them, tell them the truth about war, about Verdun, about what it does to you. But they wouldn't have listened. We hadn't listened to the veterans of 1870. Each generation has to learn the same lesson in blood. The Second War came in 1939. I was too old to fight by then, thank God. Watched it happen from the sidelines. Watched France fall in 1940. Watched the occupation. Watched the liberation. More destruction, more death, more young men learning what war really means. Verdun became famous after the First War. A symbol. They built monuments there, ossuaries filled with the bones of the unidentified dead. Hundreds of thousands of them, just bones now, mixed together, French and German impossible to distinguish, made it a memorial, a place of pilgrimage. I never went back, couldn't. The thought of returning to that place even decades later, even in peace, no. The Verdun I knew wasn't a memorial. It was a living nightmare. Going back would just be opening old wounds that had never really healed anyway. People ask me about it sometimes. About Verdun. About what it was like. They want stories. Want to understand. I tell them it was hell. They nod. Think they understand. But they don't. Can't. Hell is a word. Verdun was reality. There's a difference between the word and the thing itself that can't be bridged with explanations. They shall not pass. The phrase became famous, a rallying cry, symbol of French determination. They teach it in schools now, hold it up as something to be proud of. I say it sometimes quietly to myself, but not with pride, with something else. Bitterness, maybe, or sorrow. We held them. That's true. They did not pass. But the cost of holding, the price we paid, was it worth it? I don't know. Can't know. How do you weigh 700,000 dead against strategic objectives? How do you calculate the value of symbolic victories? How do you measure the worth of not losing when winning would have required even more death? The generals said it was necessary. The politicians said it mattered. The historians say it was inevitable. Maybe they're right. Maybe Verdun had to happen. Maybe all that suffering and death was the price of eventual victory. But I was there. I saw what the price actually looked like. Not in strategic terms or historical analysis, but in bodies, in broken men, in lives destroyed, in futures that never happened. And from that perspective, from ground level where the price was paid in blood and sanity, I can't say it was worth it. I'm 70 years old now. Most of the men who fought at Verdun are gone, dead from age or from wounds that took decades to kill, or from suicides, or from the Second War. Soon there will be none of us left, the last witnesses to what really happened there. And when we're gone, Verdun will be just history, just a chapter in textbooks, just a memorial with bones and monuments. The reality of it, the lived experience, the true horror, that will die with us. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some things shouldn't be remembered in their full truth. Maybe the sanitized version, the historical version, the heroic version. Maybe that's easier for people to carry, but I remember. I remember the mud and the blood and the screaming. I remember the smell of death and gas and fear. I remember the sound of the guns, endless and mechanical. I remember the faces of the men who died and the faces of the men who survived but were destroyed anyway. I remember Verdun as it really was, not as symbol or lesson or memorial, but as the hell that consumed us all, the mill that ground us to powder, hearts and bodies alike. I survived Verdun, but Verdun never left me. Carried it with me for 54 years now. Will carry it until I die. And when I die, maybe then I'll finally be free of it. Maybe then the nightmares will stop. Maybe then I can rest. Or maybe Verdun follows us even into death. Maybe it's a weight we carry forever in this life and whatever comes after. Maybe that's the real price of survival. Not death, but eternal haunting. Forever marked by what we saw and did and endured. They shall not pass. We held the line. We survived. But we never came back. None of us came back. The men who went to Verdun in 1916 died there one way or another. Some bodies stopped moving. Others kept walking. But we all died at Verdun, all of us.